Hello, everybody. My name is Tiffany Allen, and thank you all for tuning in to the second episode of Just Eco. Today, we will be talking about agenda setting and feminine styles and how that is intertwined into the broad topic of climate justice. Today, I'll be interviewing Dr. David Pellow, who is the Dawson Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where he teaches courses on social change, movements, environmental justice, human-animal conflict, sustainability, and social inequity. His teaching and research focuses on ecological justice issues in the U.S. and globally. His books include What is Critical Environment for Justice, Total Liberation, The Power and Promise of Animal Rights, and Radical Earth Movement, Resisting Global Topics, Transnational Movements for Environmental Justice, Garbage Wars, The Struggle for Environmental Justice in Chicago. He also co-authored 2 books with Lisa Sun. He Parks the Slums of Aspen Immigrants versus the Environment in America's Eden and the Silicon Valley of Dreams, Environmental Injustice, Immigrant Workers, and the High-Tech Global Economy. He has served on the boards of directors for the Community Environmental Council, the Global Action Research Center, Greenpeace USA, International Rivers, and the Fund for Santa Barbara. Thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Pellow. We are excited you are here, and we are ready to listen to you.
All right. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. In terms of my physical description, I am an African-American man with fair skin, with very little hair, and I'm wearing a suit. So greetings from Santa Barbara. I want to acknowledge that the land I work and live on is unceded traditional ancestral lands, territories, and waters of the indigenous Chumash peoples. And I want to offer my thanks and greetings to Chumash indigenous leaders and elders for giving me the opportunity to build relationships of trust and respect, reciprocity, and consent between my university and their various bands. So today I'm honored to be here with you, so thank you.
So my first question to you is about agenda setting. Agenda setting is explained as a distinguish between individual opinion, what people believe, and the public's perception of the salience of the issue. So could you explain how agenda setting is used to explain climate justice?
Is this term of climate injustice. And I think most of us are familiar with this, but I want to underscore that what we mean by this is the fact that climate disruptions affect communities, regions of the globe, nations very differently, very unevenly. And specifically, we see the global South, poor or low income and low wealth nations and communities, indigenous communities, immigrant communities, communities of color being harmed disproportionately by climate disruption. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we do have a vision, a positive vision of change that we are working toward, and I count myself in that as an activist scholar. And this is the vision of climate justice. It's not totalizing. There are other visions out there that are great, but this is part of an overall important strategy that is aimed at addressing climate disruption or climate change while simultaneously dissolving or alleviating those unequal burdens that are created by climate change and climate disruption. So, we are people of faith. And for me, as a person of faith, I really do zoom in on this question of justice and accountability. And for me, that's really important. And I want to talk about that right now. I want to break this down a step further and point out that justice is, according to every document that I've ever come across, as someone who lives in the United States, it's a core principle of democracy and is also tightly linked with environmental and climate protection. How so? Well, it turns out that the empirical evidence on this is quite clear that those communities, those counties, those states, and even those nations with stronger protections for women and other marginalized communities also tend to have stronger climate and environmental protections. This isn't a law of physics or a law of nature, but it is a very, very strong trend. In other words, those societies with healthy indicators of equity, social equality, democracy, and justice for humans tend to also have stronger environmental protection as well. So one conclusion you might draw is that if we want ecological sustainability, if we want climate protection, then a really good way to get there is to strengthen our democracies, to work for social justice, and strengthening our social systems that facilitate justice for all. So now I want to talk about some specific cases around the world or specific trends that we see across geographic space that really raise these important questions and give us a sense of where we might be going. So let's talk about the continent of Africa and the problem of climate disruption. The African continent's economies are largely dependent on farming and natural resource extraction and export. These are industries that are deeply affected by anthropogenic, human-caused climate disruption. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been very clear that Africa is the continent most at risk from climate change, from climate disruption. And one of the things, a number of the things we're seeing there is reduced agricultural productivity that is related to rising temperatures, which is already leading to and contributing to food insecurity, hunger, political and ethnic conflict, and refugee crises. And this is sort of a fundamental rule of ecology and social justice. If you close yourself off to the rest of the world and think that you don't have connections to other human beings and non-human natures on planet Earth, wake up. Because many folks in Europe, for example, are saying, oh, the climate crisis isn't real, the refugee crisis, we don't need to pay attention to that. Well, people are knocking on your door, Europe, precisely because they are being forced from their homes for a whole host of reasons, one of which is the climate crisis. So with respect to the question of climate justice, this comes to the fore because African societies are less responsible for climate emissions, right? Lower per capita energy consumption and lower greenhouse gas emissions than almost anywhere else on planet Earth. And yet they're getting the brunt of the impact of anthropogenic climate disruption. That's why we call this an injustice. Folks on the African continent are contributing the least, in many cases, to the problem and getting hit among the hardest. Sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest region on Earth in strict economic terms. Now, that won't surprise most folks, but what might surprise you is that it is the single most profitable investment site on planet Earth due to the abundance of natural resources and politically repressed populations. And so the struggle for climate justice on the African continent absolutely has to be a part of the broader struggle against modern day colonialism. That is the control of people and our ecosystems by invading economies and nations.
So my next and final question is about feminine styles. Feminine styles means and is altered from a means of empowering audiences to find individual truths that can be used for the greater community good to a means of empowering audiences to express their personal knowledge in the support of a quote-unquote truth that is based on a collective experience. So could you give me examples of feminine styles that are in correspondence to the topic of climate justice.
Ellison and Aaron Mayer have long been leaders in the struggle for climate justice in African American communities and for all communities. Again, African Americans, like the people on the African continent, are actually less responsible than many other Americans for producing carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, but have been disproportionately burdened with the costs of climate change and climate disruption. For example, African Americans live in greater proximity to coal-fired power plants, which is the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions on Earth, and they face greater vulnerability to asthma, to heat waves, and to so-called natural disasters and food insecurity. And African Americans pay, on average, higher energy prices than most Americans. And so for me, this is really the essence of climate injustice. But again, I want to underscore that folks are rising up peacefully, lovingly, and nonviolently to articulate visions of change. This is a photo of hundreds of Indigenous folks who came together several years ago in the state of North Dakota to peacefully oppose the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And really, one of the points here is that, like African Americans, Indigenous communities face particular threats from climate disruption. They scored a legal victory back in June of 2020, where a judge ordered the company involved here to cease and desist because this pipeline is threatening, it's an underground oil pipeline that's threatening sacred sites, drinking water, and the lands of Indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, that judge's decision was later reversed, and we are hoping that the Biden administration will take definitive and decisive action to cancel the Dakota Access Pipeline once and for all. So again, Indigenous peoples are being threatened by climate change first and foremost through the extraction of gas, oil, coal, and Indigenous folks have been rising up. Back in 2009, a group of Indigenous leaders came together in Anchorage, Alaska, to pen what is called the Anchorage Declaration, which really underscored and declared that Indigenous peoples have to produce their own food and control their own lands and waters according to their own customary laws, free from the influence of extractive industries, free from the evil and the violence of deforestation and chemical-based industrial food production systems. And they also demanded that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples be recognized by all of the other bodies in the United Nations that are focused on climate change, like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. For them, it was, and for me, it's ridiculous that you have these various bodies within the United Nations that are focused on climate change that are not also connecting that with the plight and the needs of Indigenous peoples. Peoples. So I've talked about folks on the African continent, African Americans, Indigenous folks. Now let me talk about gender and climate disruption. This is a picture of women with a banner that says "No climate justice without gender justice." They've gathered to articulate the linkages between climate disruption and gender inequality, and the linkages between climate justice and gender justice. Women experience greater vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, less access to resources needed for recovery from climate-related disasters, lower levels of participation in the political process that shape climate mitigation and adaptation policies. Women also face disproportionate exposure to climate-driven heat, hypothermia, and waterborne diseases during extreme weather events. Now, some might think this is because of biology. I'm here to disabuse you of that myth. This is because of women's social position across various societies that tends to place them at greater risk of climate disruption because they often are the primary caregivers for our children and elderly, which means they have limited mobility. They also have limited land rights and lower social status on average, which gives women less power to protect themselves during and after a disaster. Women tend to also have higher levels of reliance on subsistence agriculture, which means when crops fail due to drought, flooding, and other extreme weather events, women's livelihoods may be placed in greater jeopardy. And fourth and finally, women tend to work for much lower wages or no wages at all across many of our societies, which means that on average, women tend to have fewer resources to protect themselves and with which to secure resilience during and after a climate disaster. So according to scholars like Joanne Nagel, the ways in which women and men occupy different social roles in society positions them differentially in terms of their vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, their access to resources associated with recovery from climate-related disasters, and that facilitate participation in the political processes that shape climate mitigation and adaptation policies. Climate change, as we know, is no
Well, that's all the questions I have, but I just want to give you a chance to say any last minute things about the topic that we are talking about today.
the things I want to point out in discussions of environmental and climate justice among environmentalists, we often get the sense that diversity is a secondary or a third order concern. But I really want to underscore that there is no climate justice, there is no solution to the climate crisis if we aren't simultaneously addressing the problem of equity. And so I often say diversity is not just a box to be checked. It's not just an afterthought where you say, let's lower the greenhouse gas emissions, let's solve the climate crisis, and then wait, what's that other thing we got to do? Oh, yeah. Let's deal with equity. Yeah, we'll get to that. No, equity's got to be at the center. Inequality is perhaps the single most important driving force, cause behind our socio-environmental crises. I was reminded by the great journalist, the Canadian journalist and author and activist Naomi Klein, who visited my campus a couple of years ago, that some of the very first financial supports for this economic system that produced the violence of anthropogenic climate disruption came from systems of racial violence, colonialism, conquest, genocide, chattel enslavement, right? So these problems are actually baked into the DNA of our system. Racial inequalities and social injustices are actually at the root of the foundation of our environmental challenges. So we've got to make sure that we center them in our solutions. So speaking of solutions, there are if not on Earth. And so some lessons I think that we can learn from these movements are around this question of what climate justice might look like is first, is that any effort to achieve climate justice really must focus on the root social, ecological, and political causes of the climate crisis. Remember my earlier slide, diversity is not a box to be checked. This is what I'm talking about. So much focus on solutions in the policy realm today doesn't actually have or reflect the deep understanding of some of the driving forces. Again, if social inequality is a primary driving force, how does any proposed solution to the climate crisis center that fact, center that reality? So systemic transformations are needed. Hence the popular slogan that we see in the global climate justice movement that goes like this: system change, not climate change, which is also, of course, an organization. Solutions, again, rooted in practices that produce the problem in the first place, make very little sense. So again, market-based solutions, I think, have to be reevaluated. Now, what I'm actually saying is that market-based solutions can have a place in this discussion. My problem, my question is, why do they have to dominate? Why do they have to be the exclusive, the predominant approach to solving this problem? Look, for me, when we think about the market and capitalism, what I think of is this. The underlying logic of a market-based approach to climate change is essentially this. We can only address the climate crisis if we can make a buck off of it. We can only save the environment and address the climate disruption climate if someone can profit from it. That is absolutely insane. That is a wicked approach to a problem. But sadly, that's the same approach that the American healthcare system has. I can only save your grandmother if I can make a profit off of it. This is absolutely immoral, and we need to call that out and rethink that. So again, I'm fine having discussions about how various market-based approaches might be useful, but if and only if we can see dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and if and only if they can actually promote equity. And I would say that's a tall order. Fourth and finally, what works is community action at the local level to build political power, to reduce and prevent carbon emissions and promote sustainability, such as shutting down or preventing the construction of waste incinerators and coal-fired power plants. This just happened here in my neck of the woods in Oxnard, California, where a fourth power plant was being proposed for a community that is 80% people of color, 75% low income, and has a neighborhood that is in the 90th percentile of asthma sufferers in the state of California. We already had 3 power plants. Why in the world would we need a 4th? So people came together from all walks of life to shut that down, but to also promote green jobs, to promote the wetlands restoration, the largest wetlands restoration project in Southern California, and to promote a Green New Deal. So many of us, of course, we are all aware of Papa Francesca, Pope Francis, who said that today we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And this truly underscores the need for moral and ethical and faith-based leadership. And I'll just end with this.
Well, that wraps up everything. Thank you, Dr. Pellow, for coming. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the second episode of Just Eco.
Thank you so much.